It's always a pleasure to be here at UT, and I owe special thanks to the editors of Trolp. Who is a Trolp editor? Or on the Trolp board? Trolp. They did the unthinkable, in a good way. They published an article they wrote in like 5 seconds. I'm only slightly exaggerating. Over the summer, I wrote an article with my colleague Seth Tillman on Section 3 disqualification. Out of nowhere, unsolicited, Trolp says, hey Josh, can you publish it with us? And we'll get online like in a couple weeks. I'm like, what? And they executed perfectly. So I have to commend my good friends at Trolp for all their hard work, and I'm always happy to be here at UT. All right, so the topic today is insurrection and Section 3. I was sort of hoping the Supreme Court would decide the case by now so I could talk about it. But that wasn't meant to be. The Supreme Court's doing what they often do, which is not what they're supposed to. And they're just taking way too much time on everything. It's unfortunate. So what I'll try to do is give you an overview of the legal issues in the Section 3 case, provide you a recap of the oral argument, which was 3 weeks ago, not that long ago, 3 weeks ago, but it's been a while. And maybe they'll decide the next hour, probably not. I was actually watching the docket this morning, nothing came across, so I think we're safe for at least the next 24 hours. Section 3 of the 14th Amendment has a lot going on, right? One question, was January 6th an insurrection? The court didn't seem interested in that question at all. Another question, if there was an insurrection on January 6th, did Trump engage in it? The court did not care about that question at all. Another question is, assuming there was an insurrection and Trump engaged in it, did Colorado, a state, have the power to take Trump off the ballot? There was a lot of interest in that question, and I'll talk about it a little bit later. I'm not sure that that's going to be the key way to decide it. But then there's another question, what Justice Kagan called officer stuff, right? Section 3 does not apply to everyone. It only applies to certain positions. If you took an oath as a member of Congress, right, a member of a state government, or as an officer of the United States. That's the key language, officer of the United States. And Section 3 doesn't disqualify you from any position. It lists certain positions. Again, members of Congress, certain state positions, and an office under the United States. This entire case turns on the meaning of these phrases, officer of the United States and office under the United States. Why? Trump was unique, unicorn, right? In many ways. He's the only president in American history who took one oath only as president. That was his first and only oath to the Constitution. If Trump never took an oath as an officer of the United States, then Section 3 has nothing to do with him. The back end, Trump's seeking a particular position. He wants to be president. Section 3 says if you're disqualified, you can't hold an office under the United States. If the presidency is not an office under the United States, then Trump has something to worry about. He can't be disqualified from the White House. So this entire case turns in an issue that, frankly, most people didn't care about a couple months ago. But I do, and I've written about this issue for a long time. But even before I got here, my co-author, Seth Barrett-Tillman's written about it. Seth is a law professor in Ireland. He's an American national, very smart guy. And starting in 2008, give or take, he started writing a series of articles. And it says when the Constitution refers to this phrase, officer of the United States, an office under the United States, it's not talking about elected officials, it's talking about appointed officials. And you know this, right? You've all studied the Appointments Clause, right? Right, Morris against Olson, right? It says, the president shall nominate the officers of the United States. You can look at the Impeachment Clause. It lists the president, the vice president, and the officers of the United States, a different category. Right? Look at the Commissions Clause. The president shall commission the officers of the United States. They're separated. The Oath Clause lists lots of positions have taken oath, but the president's not listed. He has his own oath in Article 2. And so there are a lot of very good textual clues in the Constitution that this phrase, officer of the United States, refers to people that are not elected. They're appointed. So when Seth started writing this in 2008, no one really cared, right? It was sort of an obscure legal issue that didn't, frankly, matter much. But I sort of caught on to it in 2013. I got, as I say, Tillmanized, right? I said, wait a minute. we're all textualists now, Lena Kagan tells us. Let's be textualists. And let's look at the text of the Constitution carefully. And wherever the Constitution uses this phrase, officer of the United States, it's talking about appointed positions. Inferior officers, principal officers, but not the elected president. The president holds an office, to be sure. He's an officer, no question, but not specifically an officer of the United States. We've written years ago that this is a phrase that's defined by the Appointments Clause. This tells us who the officers of the United States are. So again, I was Tillmanized in 2013, and a couple years later, a good friend of ours, Will Bode, professor at Chicago, came around. And I'll get back to Will in a bit. And Will wrote a review of Tillman's article. And it was a very favorable review. And he said, I'll just read this quote, he says, Tillman makes sense of patterns most of us never saw. He brings order out of chaos, right? Most people thought officer of the United States, office under, who cares, right? It makes no sense. But Tillman sort of put this all together in a way. And Will said in 2016 that Tillman has shifted the burden of proof single-handedly. And I read this at the time, like, wow, Will's a smart dude, right? Smart guy. If he says this, then maybe Tillman's onto something. So then fast forward to 2016, right? Trump wins the election. And before the guy even takes office, people start threatening to sue him, right? It happened right away. And what were they going to sue him over? The Constitution's Foreign Emoluments Clause, which again, no one had ever heard of before 2016, but Trump makes obscure common law great again. He's very good at this. He takes the obscure provisions and makes everyone an expert in it. Trust me, they're not experts. Trust me on this. If you haven't read about this before 2016, you know what you're talking about. Okay. But this phrase appears in the Foreign Emoluments Clause. It says that no person holding any office, blah, 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 under the United States can accept foreign gifts. Huh. So this provision would only apply to Trump if, as president, he holds an office under the United States. You're going to see a pattern. Almost all the key issues of the Trump presidency turn on whether he held an office under the United States. It's remarkable. It's stunning. We never anticipated this. So in late 2016, after Trump won the election, I approached Tillman. I said, hey, Seth, you know, they're probably going to sue Trump over his hotel in D.C., his hotel in New York, that they're serving foreign governments. Do you want to maybe write an amicus brief about this officer of the United States stuff? You know, we can do an amicus brief. No one reads them, right? If you ever read, maybe they read yours. They don't read mine. But we'll do an amicus brief. It might be fun. And Seth said, sure, let's do it. So we put together an amicus brief and a series of blog posts that sort of laid out the different language. Now, this chart may well be hard to see, but you have this phrase, officer of the United States. Where's my little clicker thing? You have this phrase, officer of the United States, right? There we go. Officer of the United States appears in the Appointments Clause, Commissions Clause, Impeachment Clause, and Oath Clause. Each of these refers to appointed positions in the executive branch or the judicial branch. And we know this. The president can appoint the Secretary of State. The president can appoint judges of the Supreme Court. He appoints people who are officers of the United States. These people can be impeached, right? They can be removed from office. They get commissioned. We read Marbury, right? The president commissions the officers of the United States. This was a judge. There's a broader category, this phrase, office under the United States. This refers to appointed people in the executive branch, the judicial branch, and the legislative branch. Wait a minute, Josh, there are appointed people in the legislative branch? Oh, there are. The clerk of the House, right, the secretary of the Senate. These are people appointed by the House and the Senate. The president does not appoint the clerk of the House. They're not appointed by the courts of law or heads of departments. These are appointed positions within the legislative branch. So these are not officers of the United States, but they hold office under the United States. It's a broader category of appointed positions, and this is where the Foreign Emoluments Clause comes in, right? That all these appointed positions can accept foreign emoluments. You have this sort of broader category, which I won't get into, office under the authority of the United States. This includes sort of weird positions. You know, for example, if you hold a letter of marque or reprisal, you know what that is? It's basically a pirate license, right? The government can give you a license to be a pirate. What are you? You're not appointed by the president. You're not really a legislative officer, but you're under the authority of the United States. There are these sort of weird tangential positions that aren't very important. Also, you have this position of public trust, which is a very broad category as well. But the key point here is this phrase, officer of the United States and office under the United States. These are different phrases. They have different meanings. And this is what we advance in our emoluments clause litigation, right? Now, our position was received not well, which perhaps can be expected, right? We put in a brief in June of 2017 arguing that this phrase applies to an office under the United States, the presidency is not covered, or if the presidency is not subject to it. And we have more than textual evidence. We have some other evidence as well. For example, who's been to Mount Vernon? Anyone? Does anyone remember these objects, what these are? You've seen them. Millions of people have seen these over the years. While George Washington was president, he accepted very valuable gifts. A framed portrait from the French government. He got the key to the Bastille from Marquis de Lafayette. If you saw the Hamilton musical, that was him, right? These were very valuable presents which Washington received. No one ever suggested that Washington was violating the clause, in our view, because Washington didn't see himself subject to this provision. Jefferson also accepted foreign gifts. Who's ever been to Monticello? Fewer people, okay. But he has a bust from a Russian emperor. He has gifts from Indian tribes. Those were sovereign nations, right? Lewis and Clark went on their great mission. They brought back all these foreign gifts. These were gifts from foreign governments. There was never an understanding. There's more evidence. In 1792, the Senate ordered Alexander Hamilton, the actual Hamilton, not Miranda, right, to prepare a list of all those people holding office under the United States. That's the key phrase. Office under the United States. Hamilton replied with a roster. He included all these appointed positions. He did not include the president as among those holding office under the United States. He included the VP either. So there's actually a lot of evidence that in the 1780s and 90s, people thought this phrase meant appointed and elected. But you know what? People came at us. This is the first of several New York Times articles about Seth, by the way. The first of several. We engender controversy, is what we do. A group of legal historians from elite universities came out and said, aha, Blackmun and Tillman were wrong. The document they said from Hamilton was not actually the Hamilton document. There's another Hamilton document, and they misled the court. Huh? So here's what actually happened. It's a fascinating story. Hamilton signed this document in 1793. This is his signature. We know it's a signature, right? It's in the National Archives. It's not a mystery. But about 20 years later, the Senate decided to publish a lot of early government documents. And in that process, someone modified the document. They inserted the president's salary where Hamilton had omitted it. We knew this. In fact, we actually said this in our brief, that there was another document, not signed by Hamilton, which included the president. And this was published years later. We don't know who did it, someone in the Senate, we have no idea. They actually destroy a lot of documents in the process. It's actually quite sad, okay? But the historians, in their infinite wisdom, did not know this. They didn't realize that the document modified, and they accused us of misleading the court. So what did we do? We fired back. We got experts on the Hamilton documents, people who authenticate Hamilton for auction houses to say, yes, that is Hamilton's signature, and the other document was not signed by Hamilton. Boom. What happened? The historians withdrew their brief. They withdrew the claim they made against us. They made a public apology. To their credit, they made a public apology and they gave them all the credit in the world. They acknowledged that they were wrong. They didn't say we were right. They just said that they were wrong. But the upshot is, if Hamilton was right, he did not view the president holding office under the United States. One of the historians, Professor Sugarman in Boston, still trying to say we were wrong about Hamilton. He's very wrong. I don't know why he's going down this rabbit hole. We got a part 2 coming soon, but stay tuned on that. We also presented our paper at an Originalism conference in 2020. It was not received particularly well. People just didn't like our theory. By the way, this is what I looked like in 2020. COVID was not good to me. But you know what? We presented our paper with those academic, who cares? The emoluments cases worked their way through the court, went up to the Supreme Court, and then what happened? Biden won the election. He won. He won, by the way, he won. Right, so just to be clear, he won the election. I don't want any doubts in this room. He won the election, okay? And after Biden won, Trump was not president anymore, so the emoluments cases were just going to be dismissed as moot, right? The court was not going to decide them. So 4 years of litigation over emoluments led to absolutely squat. It was a waste of thousands of pages of briefing, whatever. At least we got a New York Times article out of it. So Seth and I were there in election. I think, okay, we're done. Let's write about this officer stuff in the abstract. But we were not done. Why? Oh boy. So everyone knows what this picture is. January 6th happened. And on January 6th, I swear to you, I realized, oh my God, we're not done with the officer stuff. I realized it that day. By the way, I was on actually, what's the KXAN, the local news affiliate here in Austin, that night saying Trump's speech was protected by the First Amendment. I think I was the first person on planet Earth to say that publicly, that the speech was protected under Brandenburg. I said it on January 6th, that evening, Austin News, it's recorded, you can watch it on YouTube. But I said, oh crap, they're gonna get him an insurrection. And we're gonna have to do officer stuff all over again, right? So Section 3 is very complicated, and I broke up into a couple components, right? So the first part, what we call the jurisdictional element, who's covered by Section 3? If you had taken an oath as a member of Congress, or as an officer of the United States, or as a member of the state legislature, or as an executive officer of any state, okay? Section 3 only attaches if you take an oath in one of these capacities. So if you're a private citizen, you've never held government office, and you marched on January 6th, nothing can happen to you. I mean, you go to jail for trespass, right? But you can't be charged with insurrection under Section 3, right? There's no basis for disqualifying you. Okay. The second part is what's called basically the substantive offense. You cannot engage in insurrection against the same. And does the same refer to the United States? Does it refer back to the Constitution? I don't think it actually matters. But did you engage in insurrection? Okay. Third, if you, in fact, took a covered oath and you engage in insurrection, you cannot hold certain offices. You can't be a senator or representative, you can't be a presidential elector, you can't hold any office under the United States. And then Congress can leave the disability by 2/3 vote. So on January 6th, I said, oh crap, we're back in the game, right? You know, it's like The Godfather. You keep trying to get out and you can't. They keep dragging you back in. Because Trump had never taken any other oath, only as president. So whether he is covered by Section 3 depends on if he's an officer of the United States. And he's not running for Congress, no, he's running for the presidency. So again, on the back end, did he hold an office as number 3 under the United States? And Seth, if you ever seen the movie Groundhog Day with Bill Murray, it's a classic movie. We're basically stuck in this time loop. Where for the last 7 years, we keep arguing that the president's not an officer over and over again. My dad says, Josh, are we still doing the officer stuff? I'm like, yeah, so Dad's still doing the officer stuff. It's like the same thing every year. So what did I do? Oops, sorry. We started writing, which is what Seth and I always do. So we published an article in a very good sister journal, the NYU Journal of Law and Liberty. And they published it real quickly, as my good sister journals like to do. And we argue that the president is not an officer of the United States for purposes of Section 3. And for about a year, no one really cared about the article. Didn't matter. Until early 24, when Trump started applying to be on ballots, and different litigation was filed. People were suing state secretaries to get Trump off the ballot. There were suits in Minnesota, in Michigan, in Colorado, right? States that Trump probably wouldn't win, but he might win depending what happens in November. But he started getting sued all over the country. And again, most people thought these cases are crazy. These cases are insane. But then, I got another New York Times article. In August of 24, 2 law professors who I'm good friends with came out with an article that sort of shook the world. And I just want you to read the framing. 2 law professors active in the Federalist Society. They didn't mention their names. What actually matters is their affiliation. And let me just say this, I'll say this bluntly. The most useful conservative is someone who supports liberals, right? I will say bluntly, if anyone in this room is a conservative, you want to be loved, support the left. You will be loved, you'll be showered with hugs and kisses, it'll be the best thing in the world. The New York Times doesn't usually write about conservatives being conservative in a favorable light. That doesn't usually happen. But when a conservative comes out and supports the other side, it's like the best thing in the world. And who are the conservatives? My good friends, Mike Paulson and Will Bode. I respect them dearly. They published a 150-page article saying that Trump is disqualified. The full sweep and force of Section 3 means Trump's off the ballot. Now, to their credit, they sent us an advanced copy of their article. And Seth and I realized, uh-oh, we need to respond quickly. We did not have a lot of time because the litigation was fast moving. So they put their 160-page article in SSRN in August. By that point, we'd had it for a few weeks. Seth and I wrote, and I'm not exaggerating, a 160-page article in about 4 weeks. We did nothing else but that for about 4 weeks. We put it on SSRN, and this wasn't intentional. It's actually, we had the exact same number of pages that they did. It actually was not intentional. It's just how it shook out. People are like, oh, you were deliberate. It actually wasn't. It was kind of funny when it happened, but it wasn't. And we scrambled, and we hustled, and we got online, and we thought it was a very effective takedown. And Monty and his colleagues said, Josh, give it to us, publish with us. And we weren't even sure we wanted to. We didn't even know, but like, the litigation was moving quick. We had to be published. I was like, you got it. We said yes very quickly. Now, how did Bode and Paulson respond to me and Seth on this officer stuff? Not well. This is actually a verbatim quote from other paper. I'll just read it to you. And by the way, this was not changed. It was in the final published version. Penn published a paper. Penn Law Review published a paper. They got published last week, so they beat me to that, but that's fine. They wrote, the Tillman-Blackman position is hidden meaning hermeneutics that renders Section 3 a secret code loaded with hidden meanings, discernible only by a select priesthood of Illuminati. So you are all in the presence of an Illuminati priest, and you are my disciples. You are now in the cult. Welcome to the cult of Josh. You can't leave. The ritual swearing will be later down the hall in the quad. That Chick-fil-A is laced with it. No, never mind. We saw this, it's like, oh my God, they're calling us Illuminati priests. What the heck is wrong with them? But it's smart. And what they're doing is respectful. It's very hard to challenge us on our arguments. So instead, they try to destroy us and say we're just being crazy. This is a non-frivolous strategy. If you can't go toe-to-toe with someone, you try and destroy them. You attack their credibility, you attack their reputation, and you say that this is not serious scholarship, right? This is something you need a secret decoder ring for. And you want evidence of the strategy of trying to destroy those you disagree with? Talk about this guy. Akhil Mar, professor at Yale, Sterling professor at Yale. He has a podcast. I don't listen to podcasts. I think they're a waste of time. Who wants to listen forever? Just read. Just give me write something. It's lazy, right? But Akhil's a podcast. People like to listen to it. I don't know. I hate podcasts. I don't like to listen. I can read much faster than I can listen. And Akhil talked about this on our podcast. He said, and I'm just going to read this. He says, let me be clear. This is a genuinely stupid argument on the merits. I'm going to demolish it. It's embarrassing. This is very wrong. It's silly. It's so silly. And I was laughing because I actually couldn't resist, because to even hear these formulations elicits laughter from me. Again, he offers no actual arguments of why we're wrong. He just says this is crazy, it's stupid, you have to laugh at it. And look, I've been hearing these sort of tropes for years. That's trope, not trope. Trope. I've been hearing these tropes for years that our position is crazy, it's secret, and so on. We've written over 1,000 pages on this. Not all in trope, right? 1,000 pages spread throughout the journals. We got stuff. Maybe it's right, maybe it's wrong, but it's not crazy. If you take 5 minutes to think about it, you get beyond this. But there's a problem. If we're right, they're wrong. And they can't bear that. If we have merit, they lack merit. And that's something they can't even countenance. So there are all these podcasts and tweets saying Blackman and Tillman are crazy. But then something funny happened. This case goes to the Colorado trial court. The court holds a 5-day hearing. And the court holds Trump engaged in insurrection. He engaged in insurrection. They actually got to the merits holding. But then in the last few pages of the opinion, they say, oh, by the way, he's not an officer of the United States. The Denver trial judge agrees with me and Seth. This is not Reed O'Connor or Matt Kaczmarek. This is a Democratic, I love you guys, right? This is a Democratic appointed judge in Denver, a municipal court judge. And she saw our position having enough merit to write in her order, to say that the president is not an officer of the United States. She looks at the appointments clause, the impeachment clause, commission clause, oath clause, right? The same evidence that me and Seth were writing about for years. The drafter of Section 3 did not intend to include the president or officer of the United States. Boom. Right there in black and white. And I'm like, okay, secret code Illuminati, she can join the club, right? She was, again, a lot of the stuff that judge did I think was wrong, but she at least had enough sense to realize that this phrase refers to appointed positions. So at this point, Keel stopped laughing. He maybe started panicking, right? Because he realized this argument is so-called on the wall. When you talk about common law litigation, there's this concept of off the wall, on the wall. And you often want to say, this idea is so frivolous, it's off the wall. You know what argument was off the wall once? The Obamacare challenge. I lived through that. People said, of course Congress can make you buy insurance. It's frivolous to say otherwise. But we pushed, and the argument became accepted by 5 judges in the Supreme Court. All right? So then the case was appealed to the Colorado Supreme Court. There was oral argument, and, it looked about mixed. I didn't think they were going to disqualify Trump, but they did. The Colorado Supreme Court, in a 4-3 decision, knocked Trump off the ballot. Again, this is basically an all-Democrat court split 4-3. This was not a super clear issue. By the way, who were the 4 judges that disqualified Trump? They went to Ivy League law schools, Harvard and Yale. Who were the ones that kept Trump on the ballot? They went to UC Boulder and Denver University. That means something, right? When you're in this elite bubble, this is such an obvious thing. Of course we take Trump off the ballot, right? The most democratic thing we can do is prevent democracy from happening, right? We can just take Trump off the ballot, and that's what democracy needs. Maybe that makes sense to you. It always has bothered me. But in order to DQ Trump, they had to do the officer stuff, as Justice Kagan would call it. I'll get to that in a few minutes. And they say, well, of course the president's an officer. He holds an office, he holds an officer. They didn't mention the appointments clause. They didn't mention the impeachment clause. They didn't mention the oath clause. They didn't mention any of the evidence. They pretend it just doesn't exist. It's like at a Freemason Illuminati meeting somewhere else, right? We're just not going to talk about that. It's a secret code. Our decoder ring was lost in the Cracker Jack box. We're just not going to talk about it. And so they DQ Trump. The case was appealed to the Supreme Court urgently. So on January 5th, the Supreme Court granted cert. That's nearly 2 full months ago. And they said oral argument will be on, it was actually on February 8th. Okay? So the case was briefed quickly. Tillman and I did what we always did. We wrote an amicus brief. In fact, we filed an amicus brief first. We filed before the parties even filed them. We did that deliberately. That way other briefs can cite us. It was very, very deliberate. In fact, we actually wrote a brief before the cert was even granted. We were ready to roll. We had everything in the can. We're like, wow, we got plenty of time now. And we argued that this provision, this phrase, offers to the United States, does not include the president. And just to make this more real, they say, Josh, why would the framers exclude the president? They listed all these other positions. Look, here's a sequence of events. You have a person who's elected only once as president, never take another oath, then engage in insurrection and start re-election. This fact pattern was not in anyone's minds, had no reason to think about it. The example is Cornelius Vanderbilt, a wealthy industrialist, runs for president, resigns, joins the Confederacy, runs for re-election. That's the fact pattern. Put that in a footnote in an article. Any of our troll people. That's Vanderbilt was from Staten Island, my hometown, so I like him, right? But that's the hypo. And then, of course, we cite our beloved decision of Bostock. It's not the intentions of the drafters that matters. The expectations are relevant. The meaning of the text. Look, if you guys get to use Bostock, we get to use Bostock. So that's all I'm going to say about Bostock. Justice Gorsuch, we love you for most of the time. Okay. Gorsuch, when Gorsuch is good, he's great, and when he's bad, he's bad. So I hope he's great here. He's like, when he's on fire, and when he's off the reservation, as they might say, right? But anyway, but I think Gorsuch got it. I'll give Gorsuch some compliments later. They hate me. It's fine. I get it. I have to be an honest broker. I really do. Right? Goodbye. Right. I have to be an honest broker because if I don't do it, who the hell will? Everyone else is afraid, right? The people on the left will attack them all they want. People on the right are like, ooh, I want to clerk for them, right? So they're very deferential. So I serve an important role. So we have Trump at the Supreme Court. He wasn't actually there. We thought he'd be there. He didn't show up. So I was there. Tillman was there. And guess what happened the day before oral arguments? Another New York Times article about Tillman. Who is this guy, right? How many law professors in Ireland get 2 New York Times profiles? The answer is none, except for my good friend Seth. And this time the headline was, illegal outsider, an offbeat theory in the fate of the election. Right? It's hard to read. It says, when the Supreme Court considers whether Donald Trump is barred from appearing on the ballot, a professor of scholarship long relegated to the fringes will take center stage. So the Illuminati priest is at the center stage. Amen, right? We're going to roll with this, guys. We're going to make this great again. And actually, Seth and I went to the Supreme Court that morning. We took some pictures. I love this. This picture is great. My little Cato Constitution, looking at the sky. We're actually looking at the Capitol. Like, oh, that's where it happened, right? That's where they broke in. Okay, I see it. And just again, the last 4 years were not good to us. So 3 approaches came up in oral argument. By the way, the arguments went about almost 3 hours. I was sitting about 3 rows from the bench towards the left near the press box. So I was looking at all the reporters, seeing what they were up to. And there was around 3 approaches to decide whether the president was an officer of the United States. I want to walk through these 3 approaches. We have Justice Kagan. By the way, Kagan was not having her best day. Usually Kagan is sharp. She is on fire. She's en fuego, right? She was a little bit helter-skelter. She wasn't focused. I think she had to figure the case out herself. Usually she walks into court with her game plan. You know, she knows exactly what she's going to do. She wasn't her usual self. And maybe she's just overwhelmed by the case because it's so momentous. And anyway, Gorsuch was locked in. Again, when I say Gorsuch was locked in, he was locked in. This is good Gorsuch, right? This is the Gorsuch we want to have. And who else was on fire? Justice Jackson. She impressed me. And I'll talk about her more later, but she was locked in also. She came to play that day. All right, so the 3 approaches had to decide whether the president's an officer of the United States. So Kagan asks, is this rule a sensible one, right? We don't really care about the other textual cues, about the original meaning. Is this something that makes sense, right? Can you explain to us why the president will be omitted? And if you can't give me a good reason, then I'm going to rule against you. That's more or less where Kagan fell down, right? Gorsuch came out, and he, again, to his credit, he's consistent, right? I'll give Gorsuch that. He is consistent. He articulated here basically the Bostock principle, right? Did the framers of the Civil Rights Act of '64 intend to protect gays and lesbians and transgender people? Of course not. Right? Of course they didn't. No one even believes that for a second. But what's the meaning of the words they chose? And sometimes the words you choose don't always lead to the results you want. And again, Gorsuch was locked in. He says, so maybe the Constitution to us today, us moderns, to lay readers, might look a little odd in distinguishing between officer of the United States and officer under the United States. But maybe that's exactly how it works. That's how it works. We deal with the text we have, not the text we want. And the text maybe leads to odd results, but that's what we have. And then Justice Jackson came up, and she was extremely aggressive on this point. I thought she was extremely effective, too. The lawyer for Trump was a guy named Jonathan Mitchell, who was, well, he used to be a friend of mine. I'm not sure about it anymore. But he was basically arguing against his own client. It's very strange. I'll get to it a little bit later. But Jackson was pushing and saying that the history of the 14th Amendment actually provides the reason for why the presidency may not be included. Right? There's history there. They weren't worried about someone becoming president. They were about state officials. They were about people becoming governor of, South Carolina, right? They were about people serving in the Alabama Supreme Court, right? They were worried about people in state government. They weren't thinking about the president. That just wasn't on their mind. By the way, these 3 approaches map on pretty carefully to the people in this debate. So who's Kagan? Kagan's Bowden Paulson, right? They argue very clearly we want a sensible rule that makes sense. It's not about originalism, it's about common sense. Gorsuch was basically cribbing for me and Seth. I mean, I rip on the guy, but he got this, right? Whether you saw our article or not, he understood this argument implicitly. And the third position, Justice Jackson came from Kurt Lash, a dear friend, professor at Richmond Law School, who's written a lot about Section 3 as well. But let's start with Bowden Paulson. Kagan says we want a sensible rule. What did Bowden Paulson say in their article, which is now shorter than ours? By the way, Monty knows and Wes knows, we finished like 220 pages. We actually added more stuff, so we're actually longer than them, but don't judge a book by its length. But Bowden and Paulson say, for a more sensible and straightforward conclusion, we think the office holder holding the presidency is an officer of the United States, an officer under the United States. And they sort of make this point throughout. I mean, if you just look at their article, it's not very detailed. They use the word common sense, sensibly, common sense, sensibly, common sense, straightforward. They say the same thing over and over again. And when you are a constitutional litigator and you're trying to make a textualist argument, you make it. When you don't have one, you talk about common sense. You talk about Illuminati priests. You talk about secret codes. So their entire gestalt distills to this. Black men and Tillmans lack common sense. Maybe not. I tripped over the thing when I was trying to enter the room. I don't have a lot of common sense. Maybe that's right. But I want to go back to Gorsuch for a minute. What he's saying is, when you say apply common sense, it's we're using modern sensibility to decide the meaning of a 150-year-old text. That's not how originalists usually function. What does Gorsuch say? Gorsuch says, might look a little odd, distinguishing between office and officer, but that's how it works. We go with the text regardless of where it leads. And this is a hard thing for originalists to do, right? Very often the text leads you in a place you don't want to go. It's too damn bad, right? It's too bad. Gorsuch's questions were right on point. There are some officers who don't hold office. The Speaker of the House, the Senate President pro tempore, they're officers. But they're not officers of the United States. They can't be impeached. They're not appointed by the president. The Constitution draws these differences. Everyone can see this. And the only way to ignore it is to just say, this is nonsense. This is stupid, like a heel mark. We're laughing at you. Well, the Supreme Court's not laughing anymore. Now, look, we might lose. I don't want to pretend the court might say, Black men and Tillman are nonsense. But the only way they say we're nonsense is to ignore our arguments. And if they ignore our arguments, I consider that a victory, right? They couldn't address it. They couldn't rebut it. And then you have Justice Jackson. Again, I've just been impressed by her. She, during her confirmation hearing, came out and said, I'm an originalist. She did not have to say that. Like, no one's putting a gun to her head. She said, I think she actually believes it. During the affirmative action case, Harvard versus Students of Fair Admission, she was talking at great length about how the framers of the 14th Amendment enact a lot of legislation that looks like affirmative action. You have the Freedmen's Bureau Act. You have different types of assistance for the former slaves. She's interested in this area, which I'm happy with. And she says, look, the framers were not thinking about the presidency, right? They put a high and significant important office sort of smuggled in, right? Why would they sort of mention the president in passing? History was not about the presidency. They were about low-level officials at the lower levels of government. And what was bizarre is that Jonathan Mitchell was basically resisting, saying, no, we're not making that argument. We don't make that argument. It was surreal. If you want to listen to a weird argument, listen to Mitchell argue the case. He was basically fighting with Jackson, saying, no, I don't want to make that argument. I wrote about it. I'm not going to say anything more about it. But I think Jackson was channeling Professor Kurt Lash. Then we have Justice Sotomayor. She said that this officer stuff is a bit gerrymandered because it benefits one client, which in a sense is true, right? Our argument only applies to Trump because every other president has held some other office. But we didn't make it up for Trump. Seth was writing about this since 2008. So then Mitchell says, no, there's nothing nefarious. And Sotomayor interrupts him. And she says, well, you didn't make it up. I know some scholars have been discussing it. Some scholars, huh? So this is trolling. But I actually waved, when she said some scholars, I actually waved at her from the audience. I don't think she saw me, but hi, Justice. So I am some scholar. That's it. It's like Voldemort. You can't even name us, right? Thou shalt not be named. Well, those are some scholars. These are some other scholars. This is me and Mike and Will had a conference weeks ago. Again, we are all friends. We get along well. But the court will decide this case any minute now. Let me just sort of bring us up to speed. On Tuesday, there's an election coming up. If you haven't voted yet, you can go vote early, I think. When does early voting finish? Maybe Friday. Thank you. Yeah. So you can go vote early. Go vote. It's important. Civic duty. And the primary open election is on Tuesday the 5th. That's called Super Tuesday. So was it 20-something states have their ballots cast on Tuesday? 23 this year? Yes, basically almost half the delegates are up for grabs on Tuesday. One of those states is Colorado. The case is still pending. I was hoping, I told my good friend Jonathan, If they decide the case this morning, I was going to talk about it. I was going to completely throw this presentation out the window and talk about the case. No go. So we don't have a decision yet. The court is playing with some fire here. And I don't mean like fire emoji fire. This is actual fire because things get burned down, right? If the longer this drags on, the worse it is. So if the court doesn't rule by Tuesday, presumably that means that Trump can stay in the ballot. Otherwise, you have an election that will be thrown out later. But if they know Trump will stay in the ballot, why don't you just decide the case? What are you waiting for? You don't need 3-4 weeks to write an opinion. So maybe they can't coalesce around a single judgment, right? Maybe they don't know what to do. Maybe they're sort of fractured. One fear I have, and this is not going to happen, I hope, pray, please don't, is they let the election happen, Trump wins, and they say, oh, the case is moot now, go away. Let's say that one again. They let the election happen on Tuesday because they couldn't get to the butts for an opinion, and then the case becomes moot. Nope. No controversy. I don't think that works because actually the Colorado court said this applies to both the primary ballot and the general ballot. So I don't think that actually works. But by letting this drag on, this is very bad. Now, how will the court decide the case? One argument that gained traction is when we've actually advanced that in order to enforce Section 3, you require federal legislation. This is based on a case called Griffin's case by Chief Justice Chase. We think this case was right. We think Congress has to enforce Section 3. I can talk about that in the Q&A if you want. As much as I love that argument, I hate that argument. Why? Let's say the court says, Colorado, you screwed up. You can't do this. Only Congress can do it. Okay. What happens on January 6th of 2025 when the joint session of Congress counts the ballots? And let's just say, I don't know, there are Democratic majorities in both houses. Trump wins the election, but the Dems win both houses. It's possible. What happens then? They start counting the votes. Alabama, vote for Trump. Member of Congress says, I object, because that vote was not regularly given. It was given for a disqualified candidate. Huh. And they knock out the Alabama votes. And they knock out Arizona. And they knock out Arkansas. And they go down the list. And Trump winds up with 0 electoral votes. 4 more years for Biden. Or maybe Joe Manchin becomes president if he gets an electoral vote. Or maybe Vice President Nikki Haley becomes president under the 20th Amendment. We don't know what happens. It's actually very weird. I can see it going different ways. So my point is to the court, if you don't cleanly resolve this by saying he's not an officer, you're kicking the can to January 6th of 25. And if you thought what happened last time was wild, this is going to be wild. Because you have people on both sides seeking to use the levers of government to keep their candidate in or out of office. And by the way, I don't know that you can appeal for a joint session of Congress to the U.S. Supreme Court. I don't even know if that's possible. And let's say Trump is inaugurated. The second he signs his first bill or first executive order, or he does anything, someone will challenge the court saying, no, you are not the right president. Like, you're not the real pope, right? You're not the real president. And then what happens? You have to decide if you actually are the commander-in-chief. The court is courting danger if they punt this issue. So I hope they rule, along the argument we've advanced, that Trump's not an officer, this case goes away. Or they hold January 6th was not an insurrection, case goes away. But if they hold anything short of this, the next 9 months of our lives will be absolute hell. And then after that, it gets even worse, right? Then we really Illuminati priests, right? We'll be stuck in sort of weird cult where we can't escape. Okay. That's all I have. I welcome your questions. I thank you for your attention. And thank you so much for having me. Thank you. You want? Yeah, you call people, please. Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to ask, why does it matter if the president is an officer of the United States, if the presidency is an office under the United States?
Right. So let me just go back to the text for a moment. The court can do either way, and then this might be what Jackson was hinting at, right? Trump is seeking a particular office. He's seeking the presidency. So if the court holds that the presidency is not covered, this case goes away. We'd be fine with that. The challenge, though, is that number 3 is a lot harder than number 1. For number 3, there's actually some debate from the 1860s. People said, we don't want Jeff Davis to become president, right? There's actually a lot of discussion about this. There's actually some argument that the phrase office under include the president. There's nothing an officer of, nothing. No matter what they say, they're making it up. No one discussed in Congress whether the president was an officer of the purpose of Section 3. It just never happened. So this is a much easier lift to make. But number 3 would work also. That would also kill the case.
Yeah, Brian? So I completely understand your argument that maybe at the ratification of the Constitution itself, the president might not have been considered an officer of the United States, but I'm not necessarily convinced that it might not have adopted that meaning by the time the 14th Amendment was ratified. For example, the Postal Act of 1799 specifically includes that language, and the impeachment trials of Andrew Johnson, just 4 months before the 14th Amendment was ratified, they used that terminology on both sides, both for and against Andrew Johnson. These are two topics that Trump's attorneys didn't mention or reference a single time in his brief. So I'm just curious how you've decided, or what led you to the conclusion that the phrase officer of the United States had not yet adopted that meaning if we've seen that both Congress and the president's attorneys had adopted it.
Sure. Okay, so I'll address each point of evidence separately. And this is actually a paper by 2 people named Halpern and Worley, which we responded to at some length. In 1799, Congress enacts a law that gives what's called franking privileges, that you get basically free postage for certain positions. They say the president and members of Congress and all these other people, vice president, and so on. And it says these are officers of the United States. Do you see the problem? The statute calls members of Congress officers of the United States. That's not possible. Why? We have an incompatibility clause, which says a member of Congress can hold an office under the United States. If members of Congress are officers of the United States and under, then members of Congress are incompatible. Wait a minute. Okay, so we knocked those out. Once you realize that when Congress is writing a statute, they're not required to use the same language in the Constitution, it's not great evidence, right? This is a statute drafted quickly, not much thought was given to it. It's not much to the contrary. There are other statutes passed by the first Congress that support us. For example, there was a bribery statute passed by the first Congress that said that if you're convicted of bribery, you can hold an office under the United States. But we know that Congress can't add qualifications to the presidency. So that would definitely mean the president's not included. So there's contrary evidence on both sides. The stuff from the 1860s with the Johnson impeachment, I think, is just not very helpful. Speeches made extemporaneously, right? Talking about the president being the chief civil officer of the United States and the chief executive officer of the United States, that's related. It's some evidence, but it's not great evidence, right? What we don't have, and I mean this sincerely, they found nothing. Someone saying the president is an officer of the United States as that phrase is used in the Constitution. That doesn't exist. To the contrary, we found evidence. It was a newspaper in Louisville, Kentucky, which said the president is not an officer of the United States from April 1868, right in that period. So at most, I'll concede it's a close call, right? There's not evidence on either side. If it's a close call, we look to the democracy canon. In fact, Sotomayor mentioned this, right? If we're looking to disqualify someone, we better be damn sure. Damn sure. And that's why Bode and Pulse exude such confidence. They are certain. The full sweep and force. Will said he's 10,000% confident. Oh, I'm not. This is a hard case. The court's grappling with it a month later. And even if it's a close call, you can give us the benefit of the doubt. That's where I fall. Yeah.
So what exactly is insurrection or rebellion in section?
I didn't mention that, did I? Yeah. Okay, so I'll say this much. It's a very hard question because it's not defined in any code. We have a federal insurrection statute. It's in the U.S. Code, right? You can be indicted with it tomorrow. Hopefully not you, but someone could. The statute does not define what insurrection is. You're not going to like my definition. I think insurrection is defined by whoever loses the battle, right? If it's a successful riot, it's like, wow, this is a freedom mission, right? These are freedom fighters. And if they lose, insurrectionists. And throughout the history of the world, there have been incursions against government that have been adjudicated politically, where amnesties are granted, right? Pardons are given. People say, okay, you know what? This was really bad. This didn't work out. We're going to try to clean this up. This is not an insurrection, this is a riot. So was January 6th an insurrection? I don't know. I think that's what the court of history to decide, right? I think it was definitely a riot. People engaged in it can be charged with destruction of property, trespass, and the like. Is blocking the vote count for a few hours disrupting government? Maybe literally. But there have been lots of protests in recent years where they've sort of disrupted government functions. Is that insurrection? I would err on the side of saying no. Jack Smith, who's not a shrinking violence, not charged anyone with insurrection. They've only charged with seditious conspiracy. So I don't think there was an insurrection, but I'm not sure. And for sure, this much I know. A municipal judge in Denver thousands of miles from the Capitol can't make this determination. This has to be done by the federal prosecutors, if anyone.
John, I think was next. I'm going to jump that.
I want to build on Ryan's question to ask whether or not you think that, the term officer of the United States has to be interpreted the same throughout the entire Constitution for the Constitution to make sense, or if there were, say,
Right.
positive evidence that they may.
Good question.
the president to fall under this.
Yeah, good question. So, we don't think that there's any fixed rule that the meaning, to your question as well, the meaning in 1789 has to be the same as the meaning in 1868. We don't think that's the case. In fact, we think that the meaning of office under the United States drifted. We do. We actually argued this in our paper. This is why we don't make number 3 argument very strongly to your question before. We think it's a good argument, but we don't make it as strong as we could. But what's unique about this provision is you have an anchor, which is the appointments clause. Everyone read the appointments clause for decades, and they knew what appointment meant. And they read the oath clause. I don't have it on the screen here, but if you look at the Article 6 oath clause, it closely tracks what's here. And what we think happened is they said, okay, all these people took an oath under Article 6, we're going to bring that language forward. And there's a maxim by Justice Frankfurter who said it, that when you take an old statute, you bring the soil with it. Right? When you use this language, you bring it forward. And there's no evidence to the contrary. There are treatises in the 1870s saying the people referenced in this clause are the same people referenced in Article 6. They say this. They made the same observation we do. And if it's the same people, and in Article 6 doesn't mean the president, then this doesn't mean the president either. So, John, you don't have to have the same meaning over the course of 80 years. Drift can happen. We don't think drift happened here.
Joe?
Yeah, real quick, just to follow up on your opinion of January 6th, I think it's worth pointing out that the only reason it didn't go further than the stalling Congress, the county would go from more than $1,000 was because of the resistance of the people engaging that met. There's no telling what would have happened if the Capitol Police hadn't actually been able to prevent it. So I'm not sure that opinion is fully thought out on your part, but as a follow-up to your opinion on the whether Trump's speech that day was First Amendment protected, would you be willing to reconsider that if he's indeed indicted on the charges surrounding January 6th, or would you not be independent of that, of any criminal conviction?
Well, it's actually, I want to answer both parts of your question if I may. It's actually a very, very thoughtful question. The issue with J6 has to do not just with the resistance they met at the Capitol, but what resistance was in place beforehand. And there's actually some good evidence they didn't have enough force at the outset. And if there had been more force at the outset, they never would breach the wall.
That doesn't help your argument you made a second ago.
It doesn't. No, it doesn't. We know what happened, though, right? The second element is the timing, right? Trump started tweeting about J6 much earlier. It's going to be wild, right? Remember those tweets in December. For purposes of the First Amendment in Brandenburg, can you consider the month of context that came before, or you limit to considering the speech? And let me just tweak that a little bit. By the time Trump got to the podium, people were already breaching the Capitol. So people who hadn't even heard a word that Trump said were already on their way. The ellipse is about 1.5 miles away from the Capitol. It's about a 40-minute walk without congestion. So if you actually had watched Trump's speech and said, you know what, I'm going to go march in the Capitol, and actually walked over, by the time you got to it, the thing was already happening, right? Maybe you were exacerbating, maybe you were making it worse, but it already happened. So whether there's insurrection is almost secondary for whether Trump engaged in it himself. In other words, with his speech and act of engaging in the insurrection, that's actually the harder point. Whatever Trump did on January 6th, I don't think amounts to engagement. It's an active verb, right? It's an act. It's not a passive act. So to your point, again, imagine that the force had been twice as large and they overwhelmed the U.S. Capitol Police and they occupied the Capitol for 12 hours, 24 hours, whatever it happened to be. Eventually, I think the U.S. military is larger than whatever force they had. They would have cleaned out the building, right? They would have counted the next day or the day after. So again, the duration of the suspension could have mattered depending on what happened. But did Trump himself engage in it? I don't think the speech amounts to engaging in insurrection. He might have given aid and comfort to them, but that's not enough. The text, aid and comfort has to do with giving support to enemies, right? Enemies is the term in public international law that refers to foreign hostiles, right? Declared war. There was no hostile declared war on J6. All right.
I'm sorry, just
Please.
one last time. I know.
We got one more person asking a question over here.
I'm happy to talk.
Real
Yeah.
quick follow-up. If you were Jack Smith, you would ignore the entire 3 months that led up to
60 seconds
in terms of.
If I was a federal judge reviewing the First Amendment, I would ignore it. Jack Smith could consider it.
I'm curious the idea of the commander-in-chief as a military officer, and whether that would have any bearing here?
Yeah, we get this argument a lot. The president's commander-in-chief is a civilian, right? He doesn't wear a uniform, right? He's not subject to the UCMJ. We have a unique government that we have a civilian commander-in-chief, so he's a civilian officer. The court said this many times. I know we have to go through maybe one more question. Anyone else?
I think that's all the time we really.
And I'm happy to come up afterwards to ask questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.